Hey there, my name is James Lee. Welcome to my channel 5149, where I talk business, politics, and society, all with the goal of helping us understand our crazy world just a little bit better. And today, I want to talk about the business of war. Specifically, we're going to examine together an example of how business entanglements can impact our foreign policy making.
Over the past few days, there have been growing calls for the United States and NATO to establish a no-fly zone over Ukraine.
Okay, so before I dive into everything, a bit of a disclaimer. Obviously, I'm not a military strategist nor an expert in geopolitics, so I can't and I won't be commenting on whether or not the idea of establishing a no-fly zone over Ukraine would be a strategically smart or dumb thing to do. There are other people who can break that down. I also realize that I have a certain privilege to be able to sit here and pontificate about this kind of thing in the safety and comfort of home, while there are millions of people in Ukraine, a bunch of other places around the world, who have to tangibly deal with the realities of violent conflict. So, of course, I would want to voice my support for these people, with my hope being for all these kinds of things to end quickly. But alas, it probably won't, unfortunately. So here we are, talking about war, and like I was saying, we're going to dive specifically into the idea of establishing a no-fly zone over Ukraine. So first off, what is a no-fly zone? No-fly zones are a commitment to patrol and, if necessary, shoot down military aircraft that fly in the declared area, generally for the purpose of protecting civilians. In Ukraine, that would mean the US and its NATO allies sending in jets to patrol Ukraine's skies and being willing to shoot down any Russian planes that enter the protected airspace. Since Russian planes are flying combat missions in Ukraine and showing no signs of stopping, any no-fly zone puts us on a direct path to a shooting war between the world's largest nuclear powers. So in such a situation as this, I would think that there are, of course, military considerations, national security considerations, of course, humanitarian considerations, but unfortunately also business considerations, something that President Eisenhower warned us of in his farewell address, where he coined the term military-industrial complex. Increasingly, we are seeing a growing complex web of connections tying together the military, the politicians, the government, defense contractors, and other corporations that profit from, or at the very least have stakes in, war. When it comes to this issue specifically, most recently, 27 foreign policy experts called for a no-fly zone in Ukraine. Their message is being bankrolled, however, by arms manufacturers and fossil fuel interests. Let's all together take a close look at this letter. I'm going to read a few excerpts from it. Letter's titled, "Open Letter Calling for Limited No-Fly Zone." Quote, "We, the undersigned, urge the Biden administration, together with NATO allies, to impose a limited no-fly zone over Ukraine, starting with protection for humanitarian corridors that were agreed upon in talks between Russian and Ukrainian officials on Thursday. What we seek is the deployment of American and NATO aircraft, not in search of confrontation with Russia, but to avert and deter Russian bombardment that would result in massive loss of Ukrainian lives. It is time for the United States and NATO to step up their help for Ukrainians before more innocent civilians fall victim to Putin's murderous madness. Ukrainians are courageously defending their country and their freedom, but they need more help from the international community. A U.S. NATO enforced no-fly zone to protect humanitarian corridors and additional military means for Ukrainian self-defense are desperately needed, and needed now." All right, so here's my interpretation of this letter, a couple of the main points that they make. One, the ultimate goal of a no-fly zone is humanitarian in nature, and two, it's not meant to escalate into a direct confrontation with Russia. Like I was saying before, I don't really have enough knowledge to comment on whether this is the right strategy or if it's even possible to achieve both of the objectives they are laying out. But I do want to take a second to look at the signatories of this letter to understand if there are any considerations beyond humanitarian considerations that might drive some of these folks to advocate for such a policy as the no-fly zone. This is going to be based on Jacobin Magazine reporting, but I'm going to rattle off a list of signatories and their various business ties. Number 3 on the list, General Philip Breedlove, former Supreme Allied Commander Europe. Philip Breedlove serves on the board of advisors of the Center for a New American Security, CNAS, a hawkish liberal think tank that has been used to staff Democratic administrations, including this one. Besides the Pentagon, Northrop Grumman is CNAS's top donor, with Raytheon, Palantir, BAE, Boeing, Booz Allen, Lockheed, and General Dynamics in lower tiers of contributors. Next on the list, Ian Brzezinski, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense. Ian Brzezinski had a 5-year stint as a principal in Booz Allen Hamilton, a Pentagon contractor, before going to lead the Brzezinski Group, described as a strategic advisory firm serving U.S. and international commercial clients in the financial, energy, and defense sectors. John Kornblum, former Assistant Secretary of State and U.S. Ambassador to Germany. John Kornblum is a senior advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, a think tank that counts Northrop Grumman as one of its 2 largest corporate donors and that also receives donations from firms like General Atomics, Lockheed Martin, and Boeing. There's a bunch more folks with private sector and defense contractor ties. I'll link the Jacobin article that I'm citing in the description below. Definitely worth checking out in terms of unraveling the complex web of potential conflicting interests that would imply that their collective advocacy for a no-fly zone could extend beyond humanitarian considerations for the Ukrainian people. Not that Ukrainians are not suffering, I'm just talking about specific interests that heavily impact U.S. foreign policy making. I hope you understand where I'm coming from. And I don't think we can ignore the role of media in this discussion either. Quote, with knowledge of the contemporary military-industrial complex and corporate media, the connections between the two become hard to ignore. Through outright corporate ownership, interlocking directorates, that's when the same individual sits on more than one company board, revolving doors, the circulation of the same people working for the government, military contractors, and media corporations, embedded journalism, that's when reporters live and travel with troops during military conflict, and over-reliance on official, i.e. military, government, and Pentagon sources, the corporate media is undeniably linked in complex but powerful ways to the military-industrial complex. I think these are themes that come around again and again on this channel. Very concerning, you could say, the interconnectedness between corporate America, just within the business community itself, with people who serve on the boards of multiple companies, oftentimes with conflicting interests, say, of a pharmaceutical company and a media conglomerate. But also the numerous financial entanglements between corporate America and the government, once again with troubling, very troubling conflicts of interest. Cabinet members who were former lobbyists and vice versa. Lloyd Austin, our Secretary of Defense, is a great example of this. He's a former board member of Raytheon, a defense contractor.
I'm going to start with you, Kurt Volker. Let's talk about that no-fly zone. Explain exactly. You are one of the few people who's come out and just been outspoken in saying that it's something that should be done. Why do you think so, and how exactly would it work? What is it?
Right. Well, let's start with the moral obligation. When we see civilians being killed like this, and what Putin is doing to Ukraine now, it's very reminiscent of the worst days of the 1930s and what Hitler did in Europe. And we told ourselves, never again. And so we have a requirement to do something here.
That was Kurt Volker on PBS NewsHour recently, and he's making quite the emotional appeal, conjuring up images of Nazi Germany to make his case for the no-fly zone in Ukraine. I just want to point out, interestingly, PBS presents his credentials as the former U.S. ambassador to NATO, but leaves out the fact that he is a part of the Center for European Policy Analysis, the CEPA, a think tank that in 2021 counted defense firms BAE Systems, General Dynamics, General Atomics, and Lockheed among its list of contributors. Volker is also the international managing director for and co-chair of the advisory board to the BGR Group, which, quote, represents major defense and aerospace companies, aerospace suppliers, government service providers, nonprofit organizations, and state and municipalities that have an interest in U.S. defense policy. It's like, look at all this suffering over here, all very real, but don't mind the windfall of cash that's coming my way over here. The unfortunate reality is that cable news and even PBS, like we just saw there, who I view to have consistently much better coverage, will bring on guests who are supposedly foreign policy experts, describe or attribute their governmental or military credentials, but then fail to reveal or disclose their current or past relationships and positions in the defense industry or private sector businesses who have a certain interest in profiting off of war. My opinion is that businesses should have zero role when it comes to intervening in a foreign or even a domestic conflict if we truly value humanitarian or even national security considerations above the interests of business. The good news is that so far, at least at the time I'm recording this, the US government and the UK government have resisted calls for a no-fly zone in Ukraine. Perhaps the threat of nuclear war is too great here, even for people who themselves have these murky ties in the past to defense contractors, like, for example, our Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin. He's like, I'd rather not get into the situation of a no-fly zone. Way too risky here. What good is all this money if we're just blown to smithereens and not able to enjoy it? It's purely my speculation and conjecture there. But anyway, my point in making this video is I think this is the type of stuff that goes on behind the scenes all the time. So even though the scope of today's topic was somewhat limited to the one policy of whether or not we should establish a no-fly zone in Ukraine, I think the application is wide in that, like I said, there are numerous instances of unsavory financial entanglement between business, the government, military, our media. So we have to be really careful in digesting media, especially corporate media in times of war. In the past, they've oftentimes manufactured pro-military positions, failed to thoroughly vet State Department claims, and sometimes even in cahoots with various governmental, military, or business interests, suppress information regarding important matters of war and national security. And those are my thoughts for the week. I'm very curious to hear yours, so please share your thoughts and ideas in the comment section below. Once again, I want to voice my support for the people who are suffering in Ukraine. This is a terrible tragedy. But I hope this video is just a small part of your media diet in terms of understanding how things work in our crazy world. So if you did enjoy this video and want to support my work, please take a second to click on that like button, share this video with other people, subscribe, hit that notification bell icon so you don't miss any of my future videos. And as always, thank you so much for your time, and I'll see you next week.